It's a great pleasure to speak at this conference and to moderate a very important theme: is social media compatible with democracy? I'm Renata Salecl. I'm a philosopher and sociologist, and I come from the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law in Slovenia and Birkbeck College, University of London. Now, just before the pandemic, when I was finishing my book on A Passion for Ignorance, which was kind of questioning why in times when we have so many possibilities to get information, we are more and more closing our eyes. And I was, kind of dealing with the issue, people who feel that they are ignored quite often, appear to even more ignore facts and reason, or, let's say, rational explanations. And quite a lot of them are finding certain kind of enjoyment online, especially by spreading fake news and conspiracy theories. So when I was dealing with these questions, I came across a very interesting study done among Twitter users. The authors are coming from American and Danish background, and their names are, one of them is Michael Ben Peterson, the other one is Professor Arsenos, and the third one is Matthias Osmundsen. They analyzed 6,000 Twitter users who have been spreading passionately fake news and conspiracy theories. What they found was that majority of these people did not believe in what they were spreading. So they knew what they were spreading was a lie. They knew it was a fake news. So the question for me became, what was the enjoyment in this activity? And in a strange way, it was anger. Now, first, these people got response when the other group, the other people who had different beliefs from them, responded to their news. Usually they got angry response. Now, the same people, these passionate spreaders of fake news, were also quite often angry individuals, angry at the society in which they lived, and they got recognition also from their own group, through likes, through sharing. Their status in some way was elevated in the online community. Now, the interesting part of this research was also that about a quarter of these people believed that the world as we know it should be torn down. They wanted that we start anew, that there is a reset in society. Some even said, we want everything to burn down. Now, it's interesting when you know a little bit about psychoanalysis that from Freud's on, there have been discussion that this kind of a desire for annihilation and sometimes even self-annihilation has a kind of an underside, which is a desire for a new, like creatio ex nihilo, as Jacques Lacan says. So in some way, these people also did not probably imagine that they themselves would die, but had a kind of a fantasy of an utopian future where we will start with a smaller group of people in on a clear slate, and they would be alive too. Now, just before inviting my participants, I would like to share with you an important news which I hope will steer our discussion, which is that when we are speaking about fake news and conspiracy theories, quite significant changes are now happening around the world in regard to legislation. Now, just yesterday, Turkish parliament introduced a new law which will punish with a prison sentence up to 3 years those people who are spreading fake news on their social media. Now, this is happening 1 year before elections, and a lot of newspaper editors are up in the air, which means that criticism could also very easily be named that it is fake news. However, one step further that this legislation goes is also that it introduces a new demands towards the providers of social media, those providers who will have at least 1 million participants on their platforms from Turkey will need to have a Turkish representative somehow mediating between, let's say, usually American providers and Turkey. They will also need to expose to the Turkish government the logic of how their algorithms are working. They will need to also provide the information about the users. Now, WhatsApp, for example, WhatsApp's users' identities will be, available to Turkish government. And if you are having a fake identity on the social media, you might get, 50% higher sentence than this kind of proposed sentence of 3 years. Now, so I hope when we come to the discussion that we kind of maybe reflect a little bit on this kind of, let's say, new turns that are happening in regard to the regulation of social media. Our question is social media compatible with democracy? We have 3 participants. We will hear 10 minutes expose from each of one, and then we will have a discussion. So our first speaker is Thomas Chatterton Williamson. The title of his talk is Can Twitter Be Rational? Thomas is the author of Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White, and he's a contributing writer of The Atlantic. I would kindly ask Thomas.
Morning. When I was asked to talk briefly about whether Twitter could be rational, my immediate response was absolutely not. It's a jungle out there. But on further reflection, that's clearly not true. The platform, by and large, is ruthlessly rational, as a matter of fact. Some of you are probably familiar with Shirley Jackson's devastating 1948 short story, The Lottery. It takes place in what might be a provincial corner of America, in which an annual compulsory lottery lends a degree of adventure and meaning to otherwise uneventful lives. One summer morning, a man named Bill Hutchinson draws a winning ticket. Bill's wife, Tessie, whose demeanor has been calm until that point, shifts, and she pleads for a redo. Instead, a second round determines which of the 5 members of their family will be the ultimate winner. This time, Tessie pulls the marked slip. It isn't fair, she screams, but no one is listening. The townspeople, including her husband and children, close in and stone her to death. In subtle, ruthlessly efficient prose, Jackson portrays the tendency, which is surely as old as humankind itself, to create scapegoats, ostracizing, penalizing, punishing, and humiliating individuals in the process. Mid-century New Yorker readers, Mid-century New Yorker readers were apparently unprepared to find such bleakness in their mailboxes, and many canceled their subscriptions in response, and some even sent hate mail to the magazine and to Jackson herself. The story was even later banned in South Africa. Throughout the summer of 2020, as the coronavirus contagion and sustained protest against racial injustice frayed our nerves, and debate around so-called cancel culture erupted in the nation's op-ed pages, I thought often of Jackson's allegory. And I must not have been the only one, because the New Yorker reprinted the story in its July 27th issue that same year. Mercifully, we don't obliterate each other with rocks, nor do we burn each other at the stake for heresy. But it would be naive to conclude that these impulses simply wither from disuse, rather than find alternative and more subtle outlets to express themselves now. The horrific attack on Salman Rushdie is an urgent reminder that physical violence can still horrifically occur, but the penalty for transgression has in most cases decreased from any kind of bodily harm to symbolic maiming and death, reputational destruction, and the stigmatizing of certain people and views. At the same time, the public square has also expanded from one small town to the global surveillance state, a kind of wicked noosphere, to borrow Teilhard de Chardin's phrase, of near total attention and observation. Until recently, it was possible simply to relocate and start from scratch, or one to lose one's good name, which is to say that a reputation once damaged somewhere might be restored easily enough somewhere else. In the social media era, however, such rebirth can no longer be taken for granted. Each day on Twitter, there is one main character, reads a very viral tweet from 2019. The goal is to never be it. Or, as another user elaborated, we're now all caught up in a third-grade recess game, but with celebrities, the president, and the potential to permanently ruin your life. Recall the case of Justine Sacco back in 2013, perhaps the cancellation of the Twitter age. Sacco was an unknown public relations director who, before boarding a flight from London to Cape Town, tweeted a tasteless joke. "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white." She had only 170 followers. But by the time her plane landed, her insensitive and inconsequential tweet had gone viral and her life was in tatters. She had become a world-famous racist and lost her job back home. A common paradox of any debate around cancel culture is that those who insist it is not a problem oscillate between dismissing it as a made-up phenomenon and asserting that anyone who is canceled deserves the cancellation. If Sacco was in fact canceled, the feeling was she had it coming after all. But consider the lesser-known and far less clear-cut case of Rebecca Tuvel. In 2017, in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia, Tuvel published a paper titled "In Defense of Transracialism," in which she compared the male-to-female transition of Caitlyn Jenner to the white-to-black transformation of Rachel Dolezal. Even though challenging comparisons and unnerving thought experiments are supposed to be the coin of the realm in the world of philosophy, there was no chance for a good faith conversation here. The text was immediately denounced as both racist and transphobic. One philosopher claimed that it not only perpetuates harm in numerous ways, but also enacts violence, a writer observed in the New York Times. As in other cases of internet shaming, people who apparently had not read the offending article were eager to condemn it. Once the article was criticized widely on social media, scholars associated with the journal also piled on, and a group of associate editors issued a spineless apology on Facebook. An open letter with more than 800 signatories, including 2 members of Tuvel's own dissertation committee, demanded the article's retraction. Though many academics rushed to her defense, Hypatia suffered waves of resignations and a subsequent restructuring in which editors and board members who supported Tuvel were removed. And Tuvel remains to this day tarred as a bigot, which she clearly is not. A certain amount of stigma, no matter how unjustly received, cannot be removed. Much has been said about the benefits of democratizing our national and international discourse and allowing a variety of voices the chance to object to offensive speech and behavior. Much has also been said about the possible chilling effect that accompanies the vigilant policing of rapidly shifting norms. And yet, curiously, short shrift has been given to one of the most fundamental aspects of this old culture rendered terrifyingly new by technology. The sadistic, gleeful spectacle of punishment for its own sake, the self-righteousness and solidarity that derives from not being it, produces an obscene joy in many people who lose themselves in the mob as it exacts its furious revenge. The French critic and philosopher René Girard's mimetic theory and his notion of the scapegoat as a mechanism of social control provide one framework to make sense of the brave new collision of human nature and technology, as well as the ramifications of this unprecedented global psychological experiment we have willfully subjected ourselves to in the form of social media, where so many of our debates now inevitably take place. Girard's argument, while somewhat abstract, is worth outlining. It starts with a literary treatment of desire rooted in insights gleaned from the Western tradition's great novels and dramas. For Girard, desire is not linear. I want, in a volitional vacuum, an overpriced pair of sneakers. Rather, it is formed in the context of other people's desires. That clunky footwear is desirable to me because it is desired by others. This is basic marketing, of course. In other words, it is through mediators that our own desires disclose themselves to us, and this can spur competition and rivalry. According to a group of scholars of mimetic theory called the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, mimetic desire leads to escalation as our shared desire reinforces and inflames our belief in the value of the object. Such escalation holds the potential of a war of all against all. For Girard, that escalation is diffused by means of the scapegoat mechanism. The community unites against a single, arbitrarily defined target and avoids a chaotic, broader conflict as a result. Crucially, a social order achieved in this way is only possible if the excluding parties unanimously believe that the person or group expelled is truly guilty or dangerous. And if that sounds religious, it's supposed to. As Shirley Jackson understood so well, finding someone to blame, someone whom all potential rivals can unite against, does not depend on whether that unfortunate person is actually guilty of anything. What is crucial is the group's agreement on the question of her guilt, so that when she is expelled from the circle of acceptance, whether literally or figuratively, her objections will go unheard. Anyone who has endured hundreds, thousands, or if extraordinarily unlucky, millions of tossed-off blows on Twitter can easily put themselves in Tessie Hutchinson's shoes. Digital cancellation operates with the logic, the rationality, and the velocity of a sucker punch. You can't protect yourself and don't even know where the attack is coming from until it's already landed. It is not, as is often maintained, merely a matter of accountability. Being held to account implies an opportunity to explain and thus defend oneself. The scapegoat's guilt is proven as a result of the peace that is won by the group's unity against her. This seemingly virtuous peace is necessarily blinding, as the colloquium explains. When a community in the throes of conflict obtains peace through the violent expulsion of a scapegoat, they cannot perceive that it is their own unanimous violence which produced the peace. This blindness on the part of participants with respect to what they are really doing, killing an innocent victim, is the one essential element required for the scapegoating mechanism to work. Girard points out that to have a scapegoat is not to know you have one. In other words, participants in the scapegoating mechanism hold an authentic and rational belief in the guilt of the victim, a guilt seemingly demonstrated by the restoration of peace. Every day online, outraged, mimetically desiring, and heretofore atomized enforcers on both sides of the political spectrum coalesce to designate enemies, heretics, main characters who are to be tagged it and duly shamed and punished. Girard's theory is observable in real time as the mob swarms and delights in the destruction of some hapless target. And most importantly, in terms of the implications for whether or not social media can be rational, all of the rest of us onlookers most certainly watch what happens and can't help but make shrewd calculations about how to avoid the same sad fate. Thank you.
Thank you. We will first have all the speeches and then the discussion. Our second speaker is Mike Cosper. Mike is a writer and producer, podcaster, author of a forthcoming book, Christian Reading of the Work of Hannah Arendt. Please.
Can't let technology fail you. So I'm here to talk a little bit about how social media has affected our spirituality. And for me, this is particularly relevant. I've spent the past 2.5 years producing a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And the story was the account of a Seattle megachurch that was planted in 1996. By 2013, it had 15,000 people in 15 locations in 5 states. About a year after that, there was some decline over that year because of controversy. The pastor resigned in October of 2014, and December 31st, that same year, the church closed its doors. The damage that this church did in terms of cult-like spiritual abuse, the reckoning that happened in people's souls as a result, was brutal, and that was the story we wanted to tell in the podcast. I'm not going to try to sum up 16 hours of story here, but what I want to talk about, though, is the way that this church, this platform, and the story itself was really a social media story in a lot of ways. When the church was planted, this is Seattle, and a big coalition inside this church that helped to lead the church were people involved in the tech industry. So they were ahead of the curve on all kinds of stuff. They had a church website before hardly anyone else did. They built a forum online, a chat forum in the late 90s. They built their own social media platform inside the church for sort of creating community online, which they sold for millions of dollars in the mid-2000s. And then probably most significantly, they had this creative team. They had a creative director who came in. He had all kinds of experience as a documentary filmmaker for huge rock bands that he wanted to keep off the record, and a couple of big brands that he also wanted to keep off the record. Trust me, it was a big deal. What's significant about that that individual in particular is that when the church closed its doors, or before that, when he kind of got fed up and left, he went and started a creative agency that today serves Apple, Pixar, Google, Amazon. So it tells you a little bit about the level at which these guys were operating. There's a significant piece of this story as well that speaks to something that William Davies spoke a little bit about yesterday, which is just the pace of innovation, the pace of modernity in general, this idea that innovation is always good, hit the gas, that infamous comment from that kind of drove Facebook's development, move fast and break things. That was very much at the spirit of the way this church plant was developed. And there was a guy who was a part of the church. His name was Brian Zugg. He's now an exec at Zillow. And the way he talked about it with me, he talked about, we were fooling around. We'd put these things online and just see what the reaction was. And then you were constantly kind of tailoring towards the reactivity. And the next thing you know, this church had a larger platform online than it did in person. They were first to all these different social media platforms. They were number one in iTunes, number one in YouTube, had massive followings on Twitter and Facebook. And largely because they had the insight to know if we go there, we're going to be able to move much more quickly. Of course, the problem was that when you have a narcissistic, spiritually abusive, maybe sociopathic leader behind all of this, you can't quite predict what the consequences are. It's kind of like that Ian Malcolm quote from Jurassic Park. You're so focused on what you could do, you never stop to ask what you should do. Zugg now, when he meets people in Seattle, and it's a religious context, he always says, yeah, I'm the guy that put the first MP3 of Mark Driscoll on the internet. I'm sorry. The fall of the church was a social media phenomenon as well. There was a plagiarism controversy that erupted at the end of 2013, and it was kind of a moment where the dam broke. A couple of bloggers got a hold of the story, began to account for serial plagiarism in this pastor's books going back for years. And then people began to gather around hashtags online, sharing their stories of spiritual abuse, sharing their stories of burnout from inside of the church. Two specific instances I find most interesting. One was that in the summer of 2014, Driscoll, this pastor, he released a video talking about all of the controversy, and the insiders at the church referred to it as the hostage video. It kind of looks like he's been imprisoned and kept hostage for a bit. He doesn't look good. And one of the things he says is, we would respond to all of this if we just knew who these people were, but they're all attacking us anonymously. Instantly, there was a hashtag, "We are not anonymous," where all of these people began to gather and publish their stories online. The second one was these rumors that were being published in blogs about this horrible stuff that he'd once said on a chat forum back in the 1990s. And he more or less said, look, they're overblowing the story. It really wasn't that bad. And then this sort of hacker-inspired group that started sending out bits and pieces of this old archive that they had gone in and hunted down and put together. They referred to themselves as YFWTWN, which stands for You Fucked with the Wrong Nerds. They rebuilt this entire thing, and it was horrendous what they uncovered. The misogynistic and homophobic and just abusive things that he said on this platform. And that really brought him down in particular. For me, coming to this story, and coming to this story as someone who was kind of a Hannah Arendt obsessive, I felt like her voice was in the back of my head the whole time. And there were three ideas from Arendt that I feel like permeated this entire story. They're the ideas of mass loneliness, thoughtlessness, and this idea of appearances. When Arendt talks about mass loneliness, she talks about how modernity weakened these bonds, weakened these connections that gave people an identity, gave them a sense of purpose. Charles Taylor talks about this as well. He refers to it as the unbundling of identity, that when you were born into a set of identities, your nation, your race, your vocation, your religion, oftentimes who you were going to marry. All of this stuff was given. And what modernity does is it sort of unbundles all of that. Those all become choices. Those all become options that you're going to identify with, which creates a tremendous amount of anxiety. And so when somebody who comes along with this sense of authority and clarity and certainty and wants to give you purpose in your life, it's incredibly compelling. And that was the case in Mars Hill. The second thing regarding thoughtlessness that I think is so significant, it comes back to that move fast and break things. Again, there wasn't a ton of consideration for what's going to happen. What are the onset results of this kind of work? And as a result, the damage was, there was no way to sort of predict the damage, but there was also no effort to predict the damage. There were no considerations about the fact that the work that they were doing, the things that they were putting out into the world had this potential. One guy accounted for me. He was like, we went to a conference in like 2007, and we saw all these people flocking to Driscoll like a celebrity, and we realized, oh no, like they take him seriously. We don't. He's just this guy that we knew, The third and final category, and I think this is where it gets, most important for the implications for spirituality today, is this idea of appearances. And what I mean by that, Hannah Arendt gave this amazing speech when she won the Stanger Prize. I think it was 1975. And when you read the speech, you get a really deep insight into kind of the workings of her mind. She understood herself as someone who was called to a contemplative life and didn't think of herself as a public figure and was very uncomfortable with the way the Stanger Prize kind of put her into the public view. And in the speech, she just sort of honestly unpacks that, that her world is a world of thinking, and thinking to Arendt was dialogue with the self. So she likened, the acceptance of the prize and the appearance as putting on a persona. And persona, she references the term as a mask, the Greek masks that they wore in the theater. And she goes on to sort of talk through all of our public appearances, all of the roles that we play in the world are essentially this kind of persona. We're putting on masks, whether we're a doctor, we're a professor, we're a journalist, we're a parent, we're a spouse. And the fact that we wear these masks, that we have these personas, isn't a bad thing. But what she emphasizes at the end is that there is meant to be in the contemplative life, in a worthy life, a withdrawal from the mask, a return to this sort of, I can't remember the phrase that she uses, a naked thisness, I think is what she refers to. She says it's not definable. She is not definable, and we don't want to be seduced by this temptation of recognition. In other words, we have to know that there's something deeper, there's something more essential to us that can't be performed or presented. I think that resonates with pretty much every religious tradition that I am familiar with. And what social media does is it incentivizes the opposite. It incentivizes a religious life that is on display at all times. And so for Christianity in particular, it's a massive contrast. I mean, if you look at Jesus in the Gospels, he rejects performance for the crowd. He distrusts the mobs. He's regularly withdrawing into this kind of life. And you see examples of this all through the Christian and the Hebrew scriptures. The life of Elijah when he retreats to the cave. It's not the spectacular in which he has this intimate encounter with the whisper of God. It's in silence. When I think about spirituality and social media, and I think about this story, I think there are these two essential dynamics. One is that there was a great good and important thing that happened on social media in this story because it democratized people's voices. It enabled the people who were victims of abuse in this community to have a voice and to come together. But it has this terrible effect. It reveals this terrible effect in the way that it disincentivizes inner life and that it emphasizes appearances. It allows us to be seduced by abusive, narcissistic leaders who can be edited for consumption in ways that invite us in, that compel us. The medium itself can hide the worst parts of people, and we believe that the appearance is the real thing. I think this is not just true of religion, of course. This is true of our issues with democracy in general. That if we believe in the appearances of things, we suspend our judgment, as Arendt talks about a lot. We suspend our willingness to think what we are doing. In Christian terms, you know, when we think about how do we fix this, how do we resolve this, I do think there's a necessary restoration of our institutions, a necessary restoration of our practices, a restoration of the inner life. And in broader terms, there's something similar that needs to happen in terms of reinvigorating civic responsibility and reinvigorating our institutions. I'm hopeful to a certain extent because of this avalanche of stories. The reason we told the Mars Hill story is it was one of dozens that have taken place in the last few years. The question, though, I think in both religious and democratic terms is whether or not there's a will to withdraw, a will to return to thinking and judging and coming face to face with ourselves in that sort of silence. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Our last speaker is Allison Stanger. Allison is professor of international politics and economics at Middlebury College, and she is the author of Whistleblowers, Honesty in America, From Washington to Trump, and her talk is Who Elected Big Tech?
Thanks, Renata. Yeah, so I see in the title of this talk that autocorrect has struck again. I'm Allison Stanger, not Allison Stranger. I wanted to begin with a quote, and the reasons why will become apparent, I hope. AI could theoretically make it possible to centrally control an entire economy. It is no coincidence that AI is the favorite technology of the Communist Party of China. Strong cryptography, on the other pole, holds out the prospect of a decentralized and individualized world. If AI is communist, crypto is libertarian. That's Peter Thiel, writing in the preface to The Sovereign Individual, which is kind of the Bible of the libertarians. And I just wanted to start with that quote because we've been debating here problems with social media, that is problems with a Web 2 social media world, but Silicon Valley is racing forward into a Web 3 or metaverse world. So all the questions we have addressed in this conference are further complicated by this move to companies built upon the blockchain. I'm writing a book currently titled Who Elected Big Tech, and I'm simultaneously thinking about Web3 ethics. That's not our topic today, but I wanted to assure you that thinking about these social media Web 2 problems are absolutely a necessary condition for averting catastrophe catalyzed by blockchain innovation. That is the world of cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance. That's racing forward. From the vantage point of fall 22, there's growing awareness, I think, in both the scientific community and the public at large that technology is delivering unprecedented opportunities while simultaneously undermining privacy, individual autonomy, and democratic values. Less well known, however, is that an unprecedented shift in the balance of power between multinational industry and national governments has been a necessary condition for these new challenges. Just think about it. How else could a freely elected American president be silenced by Google, Twitter, and Facebook, to be effectively deplatformed? How else could Facebook's Instagram be exposed as knowingly causing harm to the teenagers that use it without government penalty? So this transformation has taken place. The question is, why? My working hypothesis is that Larry Lessig, writing decades ago in his book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, he's been vindicated. Code is or has become law as Lessig claimed, yet law has lagged behind technological change to the point where we've got this imbalance of power that has become dangerous to democracy, an imbalance of power between government and these large technology companies. In the United States, social media continues to be regulated by the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That's an act that was designed to break up Ma Bell so the government could encourage innovation and free market competition with telephones. Yet in the past 25 years, obviously telecommunications have been transformed dramatically, and with the advent of the internet, they're now global in scope. But this same law is still the basis of government regulation. So I think you can see that on the one hand, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, that really displayed the power of the US government to change the rule of the games. They broke up AT&T and these large telephone companies. But Trump's deplatforming in 2021, I think, symbolizes another change. That is the triumph of corporate power over government. This is not just a free speech issue, although there are many free speech issues at work here. It's ultimately, I would argue, a power issue. The large American tech companies have repeatedly expressed apprehension about the lack of leadership from Washington. It's really quite odd. I mean, I saw this spectacle in last year when Mark Zuckerberg was advertising in a well-known Washington Post newsletter to Inside the Beltway folks, basically begging for the government to regulate them. In other words, Facebook was advertising that, please help us update the Telecommunications Act in 1996. 5 days later, after I read this, on Wednesday, May 5th, 2021, the Facebook Oversight Board announced its verdict on Donald Trump's account. Remember, they shut him down. And so what the Facebook Oversight Board did was they said, it's okay that you shut him down, but you have 6 months to come up with the reasons why you shut him down, because according to your terms of service, there is no connection between your actions and the rules on the books. And indeed, it's true. We have a whistleblower from Twitter, a Black American woman, who basically has told us that he was repeatedly violating the terms of service, but because Facebook had a special exception rule for prominent individuals, he was not shut down until the Capitol was burning. Okay, so they're supposed to come up with new rules. Has anybody seen those new rules? 18 months have passed, and to the best of my knowledge, Facebook and the Oversight Board have not bothered to answer. It's interesting because if you read that ruling, it really sounded like what Facebook was being tasked to do was work of government. It wasn't work of a private corporation. Now, some of you might not know what the Facebook Oversight Board is, so I want to say a little bit about that, because it's an interesting institutional development as we think about global governance of technology in a world of autonomous weapons and all sorts of other dangerous things. It's a board on content moderation that was announced in September 2019, and it's funded by an independent trust. The original 40-member board was devised after months of public consultation with experts and institutions all around the world. It's a global board. In terms of design, it's something wholly new. It is a paragovernmental organization with no government or legal regulation that floats above individual countries and renders judgments with local ramifications. That is, its composition circumvents nation states entirely, and it's not the European Union, nor the United States, nor the World Trade Organization. It looks like a court, but Facebook is not a country. It also doesn't aspire to serve law in any way, either domestic or international. It exists, I would say, as a body of ultimate appeal, and in that sense, it resembles something very old: the private government of the king's court. Yet Zuckerberg insists that Facebook will abide by its decisions, which is not how monarchs typically behave. He insisted that, but they haven't done what they were supposed to do, and Donald Trump is still deplatformed. I personally am not upset about that, but I think it does set a dangerous precedent. Well, where do things presently stand on Donald Trump's assorted megaphones? Twitter's ban is permanent, YouTube's ban is indefinite, and Facebook's, as I've already told you, is currently in a state of suspended animation. Well, why has big tech become so powerful? That's really the topic of my book, and I wanted to give you a little flavor of what I'm trying to grapple with there. It's important to realize that today's corporations, unlike their imperial antecedents, are not national enterprise. The East India Company, for example, in the British Empire, was a wholly national enterprise. It served the interests of the British Empire. These companies are multinational in scope, which means that much like today's working class, these corporations have no country. This in part accounts for their disproportionate power vis-a-vis national governments, because they can do all sorts of things to circumvent national rules and regulations. But this is not the whole story. There are at least 3 other reasons why big tech has such disproportionate power, and I'll conclude with these just to get you thinking a little bit for our discussion. Why? Why this disproportionate power? Well, first, the big 5, that is Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, they control the platforms we use, and those platforms are the infrastructure, the working infrastructure of both business and government. That's phenomenal power. Second, the power of big tech is concentrated, whereas government power is diffuse due to both federalism, say within the United States, and the degree to which government functions have been privatized. So there's a big movement now to break up big tech. Very interesting book, if you're interested in this issue, by Zephyr Teachout, who is a senior fellow of the Hannah Arendt Center, called Break 'em Up. That's worth reading. But the power is concentrated in a manner unseen previously. Third reason why big tech has such power is they have strong incentives to engage politically. They have large lobbying wings, both because their customers and their employees do not want to be partners in social injustice and are using their voice to influence corporate as well as government policies. So that's another way of saying that there's a very real possibility that you can influence corporate behavior through the employees who are increasingly organizing because they don't want to work for companies that have tools that perpetuate racial bias and so forth. So that's something to watch in the future, is the whistleblowers and the working organizations. So in conclusion, who elected big tech? We, as American consumers, have done so. The challenge before us is what we, as American citizens, have to say about where we go from here. So thank you for your attention. I hope we'll have some good discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. And thank you, all speakers. And I think that we really covered a vast array of questions. And when I was listening to all 3 of you, a certain kind of, let's say, similarity appeared in the problems that you touched. And one would be, in some way, the word damage. I heard a lot the term kind of damage and enjoyment in ruining something, and certain kind of a search for voice for someone to hear us, like sometimes this ruining and damage that is happening, especially with the stories that Thomas was talking about, is a search for, definitely for this kind of a recognition, which I was mentioning at the beginning. Now, Thomas, when you were talking about the need to have a scapegoat, you know, I was kind of thinking in some way about this kind of the enjoyment, I would say, the enjoyment in first creating a scapegoat, then the next step would be, you know, kind of, let's say, torturing verbally, mostly, the scapegoat. You were talking through many examples. But then I was questioning whether it is not maybe possible that quite a lot of people who find enjoyment in this torture in some way nonetheless know that the story might not be true, or that, you know, sort of like this kind of, let's say, presumed crime that they are going after might not have happened. So what I'm opening up is the question, really the question about truth. And, you know, let's say, in the past, when we were talking about how we will fight against government, there was always the idea we will expose truth. Let's say Václav Havel, his idea was, if only people would kind of speak in truth and they will see truth, then communism will collapse. You know, the idea was, if people were bluffing, for example, to put a communist flag in their shops, innerly they did not believe in communism, but they were just putting, you know, this is like his story of the greengrocer. If they were to say truth, the system would collapse. Now, we live in completely different times, I think, from Havel, where our leaders are, you know, excelling in muddling up issues of what is truth and what is fact, especially if you look authoritarian leaders, you know, sort of, let's say, Putin, Erdogan, Trump here, you know, and our populism very much relies now on distrust of people into the very question of what is fact and what isn't, what is truth and what is not. So I wonder if we can push your analysis a little bit further and imagine that, you know, even the readers of these stories kind of don't really care whether the story is true or not, but they're finding a kind of another enjoyment, let's say, in what they're doing, sharing or commenting or, you know, ostracizing someone.
That's a really good point, and one I've thought about recently in my own experience, which doesn't rise to the level of dealing with authoritarianism, but it does really make me question the degree to which people care whether something is true or not, or whether they have a kind of preordained understanding of who is a legitimate or worthy target of derision, and kind of the unifying energy that comes with being in solidarity with a group of people who designate somebody their enemy. Over the summer, I mean, this is kind of silly, but it actually got serious enough to the point where, like, a major New York law firm stepped in and pro bono represented me. Over the summer, I was visiting New York for a couple of days from France, and I was photographed in a T-shirt that relates to a podcast called Red Scare. And on Instagram, this image was shared, and one of the hosts of the Red Scare podcast, Anna Katchian, shared it on her stories, in the middle of sharing stories of herself being in Texas with Alex Jones. And a very diligent reporter at Gawker was reading her stories and then wrote an entire story on Gawker about me being in Texas with Alex Jones. And the hatred on social media started, you know, I'm a hypocrite, I'm not a liberal, I'm a conspiracy theorist, these are the people I pal around with. And the hate came fast, hundreds of people commenting on this thing that I was nowhere near Texas, you know, it was completely false. And when it, you know, first I said something and Gawker said, oh, unfortunately it turns out he wasn't there, but they left the story up. And then several hours later they took the whole story down. And I saw with the type of people that were rejoicing in me socializing with Alex Jones that when the truth came out that I wasn't there, they kind of said, that's really disappointing, but anyway. And it really did give me pause to your point about, it wasn't about whether I was with Alex Jones or not, it was about, there was like that you're allowed to rage right now at this person. And the reason might be that they were with Alex Jones, but that's besides the point, actually. And that's a very minor example of something that happens, I think, on a much more severe level when you're talking about, do Russians believe what is going on in Ukraine? No, they actually, from my friends who report out there, they don't actually really believe, but they kind of live in this space between belief and non-belief. And it's all confused with the propaganda that people halfway know is false. But I think that actually gets to something that Leon was saying in his opening remarks. And it's really dangerous about the kind of the falsity that spreads like wildfire through crowds. And I don't know what the answer is, but it made me think when you raised that you're absolutely right. There's a level of detachment from whether or not something is legit that just it defines the nature of the problem as well as people being actually outraged.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. And exactly this, on a more broad, let's say, level, this question of, whether someone has been somewhere or done something, is played out everywhere. Literally, you are guilty by association. Either you have been someone with someone, or someone create a fake image of you, or how the interpretation happened. You probably remembered when the war in Ukraine started, Osyanikova, the journalist, the Russian journalist, put this banner, in the studio. She ran into, stop war. And, this was like a really first kind of a public criticism in the sort of like their dominant media. However, very quickly, stories started circulating on the social media that all was fake. That she has not, this was staged, that the state actually staged it because they wanted to show that they are actually not prosecuting, the oppositioner, because at the start she got a kind of a lenient sentence. So I think that's like the power nowadays to analyze really, how the power today relies, and not only I would say the state powers or the political power, but also sort of the powers on the internet, the power which relies on, kind of muddling the question what is true or not, and, gets the enjoyment in this aggression violence, in sort of spreading those fake stories. Now, Mike, your fascinating story about this church made me think about, sort of like where we are heading, really. Now, as you probably know, there is a whole new field of studies emerging, collapsology. And the idea is that from the studies of how previous civilizations collapsed, we might maybe figure out where we are heading. And one of the ideas of those who are studying collapsology is that we are really coming to the point where churches like the one you are talking about will be, kind of really having, an extraordinary life, that we can imagine an increase of cults in the future, let's say with climate change, political tension, war, insecurities, anxieties that people are facing. The turn to religion is supposed to get stronger, and not necessarily classical religion, but the type of a cult religion, because it, in a strange way, what also you nicely pointed out, with the leaders and the kind of the authorities around them, they created a certain point of identification for a person who is anxious. Because quite often these leaders, and populist leaders too, appear, to kind of know or offer false hope. You have also probably followed the Japanese story of the Moonies, the Unitarian Church, which is quite, extraordinary. What a movement it had, which kind of led to the killing of Shinzo Abe, and President Trump actually gave a speech at one of their meetings when he was not the president anymore. He gave a keynote at this, kind of a church, which also looks quite a kind of a cult-like. So I wonder whether you share my pessimism, I would say, that the type of churches that you're talking are actually going to be on the increase, and that the new social media is offering really a new platform to spreading even more this kind of a cult-like
Yeah, no, I do share your pessimism largely. Barna Research, they've followed sort of all kinds of church growth and transition statistics for years, and consistently the sort of population movement inside churches is away from sort of smaller, denominationally rooted, tradition-rooted congregations. Those churches are dying really fast. The churches that are growing are non-denominational megachurches. And so Christians are sort of flocking into these communities that have no denominational anchoring, so there's no external accountability whatsoever. And generally speaking, the thing that attracts people to the church is a combination of very excellent music in certain terms, like depending on your tastes, and a charismatic leader, a compelling leader. A friend of mine, the philosopher Jamie Smith, the way he always describes it is, contemporary church is, the experience of the contemporary church is a Coldplay concert followed by a TED Talk, and so I mean, that's definitely the direction of it. And when these churches get, they reach a certain threshold where the authority concentrates so much, it's hard not to believe this, the axiom that absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Because you just see it again and again. I mean, Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, James McDonald at Harvest Bible Chapel, and I mean, I could do it all day. Inside Mars Hill in particular, I mean, when you look at kind of the classic markers of a cult in the way that life is controlled, in the way that sort of vocational demands are placed on people. Women in the home, they're supposed to have lots of children. Men in the marketplace, they're supposed to buy property. We're going to take over Seattle. I mean, this was literally language inside the community, and it was pretty normalized, There's a pastor named Douglas Wilson in Moscow, Idaho right now, extremely influential leader. And, he's a theonomist. He's an apologist for Southern slavery. And this is fairly mainstream evangelical right now. And he's a classic example of somebody he was part of a Presbyterian denomination and then broke off to start his own, right? And you create these cult-like atmospheres. So, yeah, the examples of this are manifold. And then the fact that you have denominations like the SBC erupting in sexual abuse scandals right now, and then incredibly divisive stuff happening in other denominations like the PCA and all of that. At the same time these phenomena are happening, the long-standing Christian institutions, largely because of social media in many ways, are having their own scandals unearthed in ways that are eroding their credibility. So the trajectory is, not good.
Thank you. Allison, when you were speaking, I kind of continued thinking about this Turkish example, which I started in the morning with, a big country starting to sort of kind of creating demands to the social media. You have to expose us, your algorithms. We want to have one person of us, kind of in direct communication with you, all the identity of our users, and so on. So, when this legislation was passed yesterday, one of their legislators who opposed, the law, Burak Erbay is the name, actually brought to the parliament her telephone and hammer, and she sort of tore her telephone in front of other members of the parliament, saying, actually, you only have one freedom, phone in your pocket. Now, we usually perceive phone in our pocket, the surveillance mechanism, the limitation of our freedom. However, a person whose only way to oppose a regime, let's say, is maybe through anonymous, or maybe not even anonymous if she's courageous, Twitter accounts or whatever, to the social media, perceives it differently. So what is your comment on this, that we're actually the communists, China, as you start with, actually somehow taking over and creating more and more, their own, let's say, links with these big tech companies, their own negotiations, and also imposing laws which, for example, other countries have not been capable to kind of, let's say, limit the power of the social media, but they're imposing this law to their benefit to kind of stay in power.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I would just link it back to your earlier quote of Václav Havel and living in truth. And to me, what living in truth means today in this particular moment in time is to expose what the real power imbalances are. And these big tech companies, it's not just that they affect us, they profoundly affect elections in other countries. I received a note from a member of the Open Society University Network in Bangladesh talking about shadow censorship before the elections there. That's also happening in India. That's going to influence the course of the election. So these companies can collude with dictatorships and authoritarian regimes if it's going to increase their profit margins, because you need stability to make money. So in my view, this is a moment where we've got to examine power at multiple levels simultaneously. And our existing political philosophy, political theory is ill-equipped to deal with this changed world. And the positive thing on that is, I think it's an unprecedented moment for political and economic philosophizing and theorizing unmatched since the era of democratic and communist revolutions. That is, the person who's going to be able to kind of grok these changes and come up with alternative structures and action plans is going to potentially have profound impact. So to me, we really need to be thinking about these power imbalances. And again, I think there are hopeful signs that we made these companies powerful. Ultimately, we can make them less powerful, potentially, particularly here in the West. In some of the developing world, you might have just one. Facebook has conveniently been bringing smartphones to the developing world that only have Facebook on them. So that's their access to the internet. And this is a whole new issue area of digital decolonization, where you might want to create your own tech. I'm involved in the digital humanism project at the Technical University of Vienna, where they're looking at a number of these questions, and it's extremely interesting. You're seeing, widening. We didn't even talk about income disparities, but the widening income gaps, right, that are in part results of automation, I think, are going to be potential problems in the future. And what did the Silicon Valley people say? And I'll conclude with this, is they say, oh, we need to have universal basic income. Everybody's got to have a working wage. It sounds really good in theory, but in practice, if you look at what people really want, I think, it's not like they want to be able to just survive. They want to be esteemed, They want to be valued for what they do. And here I think Elizabeth Anderson, if some of you know her work, philosopher at the University of Michigan, is really good, because she talks about the difference between equality of income and equality of esteem. And that's what we need to be working for if we want democracy to survive and flourish.
Yep. Thank you, Allison. And sadly, sometimes people search for esteem through, attacking others, which has been also part of our discussion. Okay, we are opening the floor to the questions. The first question is there.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, panel. It was a wonderful conversation. I have a question, and Thomas is to blame for this. You're teasing me last night about my vest. I entirely agree with everything that you folks are saying, but I asked this question about what's being left from the conversation. It has to do with capital. Here's an interesting statistic, and so I was Googling the office while we were, or I was messaging with the office while you guys were talking. Of the big tech companies, Allison, that you reference, 13% of the US market cap is represented by those firms. And if you expand that to include all tech, it's 33%, 32, 33%. And to Roger's point from yesterday, there's a hypocrisy that you could point to in that the liberal elite, the left, the middle, anyone who has a 401k account, or anyone who has an IRA, or anyone who depends on the market for retirement purposes, is very much a beneficiary of this dynamic. And one more statistic, if you go back to 1990, that 32% was only 6% of the market. If you go back to 1950, it was 0. So in many respects, a third of our current wealth base has been derived from this, again, dynamic, the emergence of tech. And that's I know it's a gross overstatement, but it's the trend that I'm pointing to. How do we decouple that? How do we allow democracy to thrive when I have a family member who once said to me, I don't know if I'm going to vote for Trump because I look at my IRA, my 401k account, it's going up. Why would I not? Decision-making as a democracy can be very simplistic and very short-sighted. And so I throw that question to the panel. How do we incorporate that dynamic?
You want to say?
I love that question. And those statistics are accurate, and there's this tremendous growth over time. So that's definitely contributing to your IRA and my IRA. But the question is, you can also cite other statistics about inequality, growing inequality, and who that wealth is going to. And it's really going to the top 1%. And the gap between those people and the rest of us is growing wider and wider. This is important because Thomas Jefferson said at the time of the American founding, the reason this experiment is going to work here in the United States is because we do not have the wealth disparities of Europe, with and also the class disparities of Europe. So whose wealth is it? And I just keep thinking about it. I had a student in my office the other day, and he's from Los Angeles, and you're talking about the impact on your IRA, and he's telling me about his dreams and what he hopes to get from his education. I'm trying to guide him in certain ways. And he's in love with this woman, and he says, we share the same values, and we come from similar families. She's perfect for me. He says, and we both want the same things. Our goal is to one day have a mortgage. And I just thought, wow. So in some sense, we can sit here in our ivory towers and our privilege and debate these questions, but how they look to the majority of Americans is something else entirely. And if we're not completely cognizant of that disparity, democracy will burn to the ground. That's my opinion. You're free to disagree.
Thank you, Allison. Any other question? Yeah, at the back.
So my question is for Ms. Stanger. Can you speak more to the notion of equality of esteem?
Yeah, if you're interested in Elizabeth Anderson's work, she's got a great, very readable book called Private Government that's based on the Tanner lecture she gave at Princeton, and she introduces the concept there, but she's now writing a 3-volume book on equality and egalitarianism. But this distinction she makes there is that, what humans really want is not to survive or not to have the same income levels as other people, but for their lives to have meaning and their work to be valued. And we live in a society here today where, look who the influencers are. I mean, it's a horrible cast of characters. these people that are supposed to be influencing us. It's, you know, right up to the very top, and they're all united by what? Wealth. Well, there are people doing all these things that are so valued, like teachers, for example, who some have to hold 2 and 3 jobs to be able to make a living wage, support their families. So we are messed up on what we esteem in the United States, and equality of esteem, I think, in Anderson's understanding, would rectify that. It would make other things be valued, because we could value the work of a plumber who's really, really good. We could value the work of a cook who makes extraordinary cheeseburgers, you know. I do too. And I think if we each just examine what it is we value, we're moving in the direction of equality of esteem. But I like that. I don't know. The concept really resonates with me.
Yeah, but this requires a serious political action. If you have been following, you know, how Britain is going down the drain these last weeks, you have probably noticed, you know, they have sort of planned to remove the cap on the bonuses of bankers. You know, they have earned since 2008 enormous bonuses. The minimal bonus they get is the kind of the yearly pay of a teacher. So, you know, it is to increase really the value of the work of teachers and others, you know, and, you know, decent work. And, you know, that is up to the government and, you know, up to us whom we vote in to really come to those changes. Yeah. There was one more.
Yes, I'm going to reword your topic here. Is democracy compatible with the mob? And mob being social media. And my experience, I'm a lawyer. I argue cases. So in a court, you argue 2 sides to a judge. I've also run for office. When I talk to individuals who don't believe in my position, but if I talk to them one-on-one, I can convince them, even the most far right or far left. So the question is, how do we get individuals thinking about things? Because one-on-one, you can convince people, but it seems to me social media, like the mob, you don't have what President Botstein was talking about this morning. You don't have that ability to have a dialogue. And I think that's what we need. We somehow have to get a dialogue, 2 sides of a story into social media. I think that's the core problem. And do you agree?
Thomas, you want to?
Yeah, I think that's such a important point, and I was really, everything that President Botstein was talking about really resonated with me, because I think that an enormous part of the problem is the disembodiment of the way that we interact now. The fact that it's a mob, but it's fragmented and no one actually is with each other. So it's like it's the worst of all worlds. But I think that you actually put your finger on something that's even more of a problem and probably puts me in the minority here. I think that the past few, at least since 2016, but probably before that, I've just started to doubt the degree to which, you know, democracy yields the kind of outcomes that are going to be increasingly healthy. I mean, if you talk about climate, if you talk about so many things, you might be able to convince people one-on-one, but even without social media, democracy is really problematic to getting the best long-term decisions made in so many ways. I don't know what the solution is. It might be it doesn't sound good, but I've really lost faith in, I don't have that kind of just unambiguous admiration for democracy the way that I grew up being taught to believe in the term and in that idea that, you know, the masses of people, you know, having deliberatory power is the best way to be governed. I've just been shaken to the core by Trumpism, by the Tea Party before that, by the kind of extraordinary anti-scientific views held. So I think social media exacerbates these problems, but I think the problem is within an uneducated mass governing itself in the first place. And I'm sorry, I think that might be really, really bad to admit, to confess to believing.
Okay, I think we from Eastern Europe, you know, still fight for kind of keeping some democracy alive. Slovenia was almost going in the Trump direction. As you know, Melania Trump is from Slovenia. Not very popular with us, but happily we changed the government so that we didn't go in the Orban type of government with a massive mobilization of people before the elections, which means that the whole kind of civil society pretty much going door to door, working the whole year in opening the issues why the change of government has to happen, and happily we succeeded, so that we don't have a kind of that doors open to total kind of authoritarian populist type of society. We'll see what happens, but it's still a fresh government. But I think, nonetheless, the ideas of democracy somehow, I think we need to fight for. I hope you're not totally pessimistic about that.
I'm not totally pessimistic, but I'm conflicted because Donald Trump might be democratically reelected in 2024.
And
I don't know what to do with
might
that.
be in the White House again. Yeah. Okay. Any other last question? Yeah, there is.
Right here. Throughout this entire panel, you guys have talked a lot about both cancel culture, but then also who elected big tech. And I think there is an aspect that we've seen particularly with Donald Trump after he was removed from technology and social media platforms, and then more recently with Kanye West just a couple of days ago. And so my question for you is, how do we sort of find this balance of when does big tech get this opportunity to remove people from their platforms? Is that a good thing? Should we have some sort of government agency that does that? But then if we have the government doing it, do we risk like a Turkey-like situation where you have dictators like Erdogan who can just simply remove political opponents? And so I guess my question is, should we be trusting big tech to remove people? Should we say you can say whatever you want? That opens its own risks. And I'm just sort of asking for your opinion on this because it's such a catch-22. Either way you go, you run into so many issues.
I mean, I think one of the biggest factors that makes it feel like a catch-22 is what experientially for those, the social media user is an opaque process by which suspension and banning seems to happen. I think if that process were really transparent, here's the rules. I mean, Charles C.W. Cook has written about this in National Review in some interesting ways, where he basically says, look, if there's 600 rules that are necessary that govern what gets you kicked off a platform, fine, just publish them so that we understand why the decisions are made. The fact that they're so random, I mean, in 2016, I was posting things, objecting to the evangelical support for Trump. And the stuff that happened to me in my comments in terms of let's throw your family in the oven, I mean, just insane stuff. And none of those people were banned. You'd protested. It was insane. So the inconsistency and the lack of transparency is, I think, the primary reason that the trust stuff is so problematic. And at the same time, I don't think you solve it necessarily with a government agency, because I don't know that the other side of that is going to provide you the transparency and the clarity. And, you're still going to be at the whims of a different kind of coalition.
Yeah. Can I just add something?
Yeah.
Really?
Allison, you answer, and then we have 2 more questions, and then we have to finish.
Okay, so I'll be really quick. There's a simple thing you can do. You can repeal Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which would then treat these platforms as publishers, which would make them liable for what they're publishing, and would, force them to uphold their own rules. I agree with Mike entirely that it's an enormous problem that, and it breaks my heart to realize that Twitter had rules that they could have shut down Donald Trump months before that they didn't put into place because they're treating prominent, powerful people differently than ordinary people. In a democracy, that can't be, especially if these platforms are, in a sense, becoming virtual public squares. And the third thing I think you can do that is just, like you're saying, render things more transparent, but let us control our newsfeed. Let us control what we see. Make that algorithm more transparent, and I think you can combat a lot of these evils.
Yeah, there was a lady there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned about Russian propaganda, and I came from Kyrgyzstan, and this is a post-Soviet country, and unfortunately, like the majority of people are supporting Putin, and they do believe that propaganda, and maybe that was too naive of me to believe that, like, access to information, social media, and all of that, yeah? Of course, I mean, that it would give people chance to somehow have alternative sources of information and then evaluate what's actually truth. And as we discussed, as we established, it's not a quest for truth, right? But so my question is, do you think, I'm sorry, I lost my thought. Why do you think this happened? And in Russia, for example, and in post-Soviet space generally, yeah, the new media landscape requires us as users to have new skills, right? And these supporters of Putin, when they see the real footage from Ukraine, they say, oh, this is Photoshop, this is fake news, this is like, they staged it, blah, blah, blah. Whereas in reality, what's staged is what is broadcasted from the state media. And yeah, so we have a lot of like villages that are high in mountains and they don't have access to internet. And the only thing they have is this TV that in Kyrgyzstan is broadcasting Russian state media. And this is the only source of information people have. But those who have alternative sources of information, they still do believe that, oh no, this footage from Ukraine is fake news. So how do you think, if this is not a quest for truth, what, yeah, is social media compatible with democracy? So, yeah, thank you.
It's a great question. And there might be a technological solution, but the fundamental thing is that you have to give those people internet access, right? And there are a couple ways to do it. Elon Musk, you know, who also loves this book, The Sovereign Individual, from which I quoted at the beginning of my talk, he's providing satellite access for the internet to stay active in Ukraine. He should do the same maybe for Russia. And then even when you speak about Russian state media, the thing that's fascinating to me is over the last 10 days, we're starting to see some fragmentation in that monolithic voice. So what that means, you know, I don't know, but you're seeing unprecedented things being said that wouldn't have been said, allowed to be said 3 weeks ago. We don't know what's happening to those people. But there is this rumbling. And I just purchased, I'll give you another example, because Elon Musk has his satellite. I don't know Elon Musk. How am I going to get him to provide satellite access to Kyrgyzstan? But I just saw this startup venture that's putting together, set up your own internet. Really easy. I mean, and you can then network the different boxes. It fits in a backpack. It's designed by Africans. And you can wire it up so that you can provide internet to a whole village. So I think there's sort of interesting things that could potentially happen if we just decide, hey, we don't want these tech companies. We want decentralized internet access. We're all going to have our individual boxes and we'll connect to each other and create an alternative space, a free space. Maybe it could be a project for the Open Society University Network. I love that idea.
Thank you, Allison. Although, you know, the problem is also whether, you know, critical media is allowed, whether we have, well-researched texts which are available to people, and, you know, the identification nowadays is often stronger with the influencers who are sharing opinion than, you know, people who are sharing facts. So that's another layer of the problems which the authoritarian leaders are very much, you know, using and playing upon.
Let's make facts cool again.
Yes. And the last question.
Hi. Yeah, I was waiting, sorry. Hi, I'm here. Hi. I have a question and a comment, and the question is about power. I think Allison, right? You made the suggestion that our contemporary moment is marked by this rivalry between corporate power and government. I'm curious why you think our current moment is distinctive in that sense. Is there? I think there's a history to this. Yeah. So I'd like to hear more about that. And the question is about this, comments that I've heard about Turkey, about authoritarian states, about underdeveloped or developing countries, and the way in which social media is somehow treated as distinctive, as the only venue of resistance. I would really caution against that narrative because in many of these countries, and certainly I can speak for Turkey, social media certainly is a convenient and accessible tool of dissent. That is certainly being targeted in this recent censorship rule. But as it was the case with the Arab Spring, for instance, these individual activists that become famous or important in social media often rely upon decades of organizing by civil society institutions and other social forces. So I think it will be, I'm not very comfortable with in that way, like treating our phones in developing countries as our only means of dissent. You see what I mean? So, yeah, thank you.
I agree with everything you say, and definitely I think Arab Spring gives us, sort of chills, what can come out of, kind of a revolution which starts online. However, where you don't have critical media, or where you have censorship of the media, sometimes social media are the only outlet for the news. And that's why China and other states are very much working in, sort of killing that dissent or controlling it by also kind of having deep, let's say, relationships with the high-tech companies Allison was talking about. So if any one of us, our panelists, still wants to add something or have a concluding remark, please, this is now the time.
Roger is signaling to me that I should stop talking.
Okay.
How about I answer your question afterwards?
Thank you.
It's a great question.
Thank you for the panel. Thank you for all the questions.